They said women didn't have the mental fortitude for precision shooting, that their hands would shake under pressure, that they lacked the killer instinct required for long-range elimination. Then Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez shattered every marksmanship record in the United States Marine Corps and redefined what it meant to be invisible death from 2,000 meters away. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly before her, a canvas of burnt orange rock and silver sage that shimmered in the pre-dawn darkness. Elena lay motionless against the weathered sandstone, her body molded to the contours of the ridge as if the mountain had birthed her from its very bones. The ghillie suit she wore had been handcrafted over months of deployment, each thread of burlap and mesh chosen to match the specific terrain of the Mojave training grounds. Dried grasses from 3 different elevations wove through the fabric, creating a texture that broke up her human outline so completely that even thermal imaging struggled to distinguish her heat signature from the surrounding rock. Her breathing had synchronized with the rhythm of the desert wind hours ago. Each inhalation drew the thin, cold air deep into her lungs, while every exhale released the warmth and controlled measures that wouldn't fog her scope or create visible vapor in the frigid morning atmosphere. The elevation here reached nearly 4,000 feet, and the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit during the night. Most soldiers would be fighting hypothermia by now, but Elena had learned to regulate her core temperature through meditation techniques she'd developed during her 3 tours in Afghanistan. The rifle beneath her fingertips was a custom-built Remington 700, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum and equipped with a Schmidt and Bender scope that had cost more than most people's cars. Every component had been personally selected and fitted by Elena herself during countless hours in the armory. The trigger had been adjusted to break at exactly 2.5 pounds of pressure, smooth as silk and precise as a surgical instrument. The barrel had been hand-lapped and stress-relieved, capable of placing rounds within a half-inch circle at 300 yards. In Elena's hands, it was capable of much more. Her left hand rested lightly on the custom cheek piece, feeling the subtle vibrations that traveled through the stock with each heartbeat. Her pulse registered at 58 beats per minute, exactly where it needed to be for optimal shooting. Years of training had taught her to recognize the precise moment between heartbeats when her body achieved perfect stillness, that fractional second when even the blood flowing through her arteries couldn't disturb her aim. She had learned to fire in that moment, to become one with the weapon and the target in a way that transcended conscious thought. The spotting scope mounted beside her primary weapon revealed details invisible to the naked eye across the valley floor. 2 miles away, barely visible even through the high-powered optics, sat the most challenging marksmanship course ever devised by the Marine Corps. Steel targets ranged from dinner plate-sized circles at 800 yards to postage stamp-sized squares at distances that pushed the absolute limits of both equipment and human capability. The final target, a mere 4 inches in diameter, weighted at 2,200 meters a distance, so extreme that the Earth's rotation would actually affect the bullet's trajectory. Elena's spotting partner, Corporal Marcus Chun, lay 15 feet to her right, his own optical equipment trained on the wind flags scattered throughout the valley. He had been initially skeptical when paired with her 6 months ago, part of the old guard that believed women belonged in support roles rather than behind precision rifles. That skepticism had evaporated during their first joint exercise when Elena had placed 5 consecutive rounds through a target the size of a playing card at 1,400 meters while he struggled to even locate the target through his scope. The wind was the eternal enemy of long-range precision. It could catch a bullet mid-flight and push it inches off target, turning a perfect shot into a complete miss. Elena had spent thousands of hours studying wind patterns, learning to read the subtle signs that most people never noticed. The way Sagebrush bent revealed wind direction at ground level. The angle of dust plumes indicated atmospheric currents at various altitudes. The shimmer of heat waves told her about temperature gradients that could affect bullet trajectory. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict how the wind would behave in the seconds between trigger pull and bullet impact. Her shooting log, meticulously maintained in a weatherproof notebook tucked inside her chest rig, contained detailed records of every shot fired over the past 18 months. Environmental conditions, target distances, ammunition lot numbers, barrel temperature readings, and outcome data filled page after page of precise handwriting. The patterns revealed in that data had helped her identify and eliminate microscopic inconsistencies in her technique, pushing her accuracy to levels that her instructors had initially deemed impossible. The current range record for the course below stood at 87%. Set by a male Marine sniper with 12 years of experience and a reputation as one of the finest marksmen in the Corps. Elena had studied his shooting data extensively, analyzing his technique through hours of recorded footage and identifying the small errors that had cost him perfect scores. She had visualized every shot on this course hundreds of times, planning her approach with the methodical precision of a chess grandmaster. Her equipment check had been completed before dawn, every component inspected and verified. The rifles. 0 had been confirmed at the shorter range warm-up targets. Ammunition had been sorted by weight and measured for consistency. Atmospheric conditions had been logged and entered into her ballistic calculator. Everything was ready, but Elena never rushed. Haste was the enemy of precision, and precision was the difference between success and failure, between life and death. The radio earpiece tucked discreetly under her helmet crackled with barely audible communications from the observation tower. Range officials monitored every aspect of the trial, their spotting scopes and high-speed cameras ready to document each shot for analysis. Elena knew that dozens of senior officers were watching from the tower, some hoping to witness history, others perhaps hoping to see her fail. The pressure of their observation meant nothing to her. She had learned long ago to block out everything except the target, the wind, and the perfect moment when everything aligned. Her breathing slowed even further as she prepared for the shot. Sequence that would determine whether months of preparation had been sufficient. The desert around her seemed to hold its breath as well, the wind momentarily stilling as if nature itself recognized the significance of what was about to unfold. Elena's finger moved to the trigger, not yet applying pressure, but feeling the familiar curve of metal that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The first target waited 800 meters away, a steel circle that would ring like a bell when struck. It was an easy shot by Elena's standards, a warm-up to establish rhythm and confirm her 0 under actual firing conditions. But she approached it with the same meticulous care she would apply to the most challenging shots on the course. Consistency was everything in precision shooting. The fundamentals that governed an 800-meter shot were identical to those required at twice the distance, just executed with greater precision and accounting for more variables. Elena's eyes moved between her primary scope and the wind flags one final time, reading the subtle signs that would determine her hold-off and timing. The morning air was dense and stable, ideal conditions for long-range shooting. The flags hung nearly motionless, indicating minimal wind drift to account for. Temperature readings showed the desert warming slowly as the sun climbed higher, but not enough yet to create the turbulent heat waves that would complicate later shots. Elena's index finger found the trigger face with the same unconscious precision that a pianist's fingers find the keys. The pad of her fingertip settled against the curved metal exactly 1/3 of the way back from the tip, a position that allowed for straight back pressure without any lateral movement that could disturb the rifle's alignment. Her thumb wrapped around the grip with firm but relaxed pressure, creating a consistent hand position that she could replicate shot after shot, day after day, under any conditions. The scope's reticle centered on the 800-meter target. With mathematical precision, Elena's eye naturally found the perfect position behind the ocular lens, that sweet spot where the entire field of view appeared crystal clear without any shadows or distortion around the edges. Her cheek welled against the stock was exactly the same as it had been during thousands of practice sessions, creating muscle memory so deeply ingrained that her body could achieve perfect shooting position, even in complete darkness. The crosshairs bisected the target's center with unwavering stability. Elena's natural point of aim was perfect, a testament to hours of dry-fire practice where she had trained her body to align naturally with the target, without conscious effort. Her left hand applied just enough forward pressure on the stocks to eliminate any flex in the bipod legs while maintaining the rifle's free recoil. Too much pressure would create inconsistent harmonics as the barrel vibrated during firing. Too little would allow the rifle to jump unpredictably. The trigger broke like glass, crisp and clean with no over-travel or creep. Elena followed through by maintaining sight picture and trigger pressure for a full second after the shot, watching through her scope as the bullet's trace became visible in the morning air. The rifle's recoil was straight back into her shoulder, absorbed by proper body position and the weighted buttstock she had personally modified. The muzzle brake redirected gases efficiently, keeping the barrel's movement minimal and allowing her to spot her own impacts. 2.5 seconds after the trigger brake, the distinctive ping of bullets striking steel echoed across the valley. The target rang like a church bell, its metallic voice carrying clearly in the thin desert air. Elena's spotting partner confirmed the hit through his optics, noting the exact point of impact for her shooting log. Center ring, perfect score. She had expected nothing less, but the confirmation still brought a subtle satisfaction that she kept carefully hidden behind her professional demeanor. The bolt handle lifted smoothly under her right hand, the custom action cycling with the precision of Swiss clockwork. Elena's manipulation of the rifle was economical and fluid, each movement serving a specific purpose with no wasted motion. The spent brass ejected cleanly, spinning away to land in the collection bag attached to her ejection port. She chambered the next round with a firm but controlled forward push, feeling the cartridge seat fully in the chamber before rotating the bolt handle down to lock. Target number 2 sat 1,000 meters downrange, a more challenging distance. That required precise calculations for bullet drop and wind drift. Elena's ballistic computer had already provided the necessary adjustments, but she verified the data through her own mental calculations. At this distance, the .338 Lapua Magnum bullet would drop approximately 36 inches below the line of sight, requiring her to aim that distance above the target. A 5-mile-per-hour crosswind would push the bullet roughly 8 inches off course, demanding careful observation of wind conditions at multiple points along the bullet's flight path. Her scope's turrets clicked with mechanical precision as she dialed in the required elevation adjustment. Each click represented a quarter minute of angle, roughly a quarter inch of movement at 100 yards. Elena counted the clicks audibly but quietly, a habit that prevented errors during the stress of competition or combat. 16 clicks up for elevation, 3 clicks right for wind. The scope's internal mechanisms were built to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, reliable enough to maintain zero through the shock of repeated firing and the vibration of helicopter transport. The second shot felt identical to the first in terms of trigger control and follow-through. But Elena's mind was already processing the subtle differences in atmospheric conditions. The wind had shifted slightly, a barely perceptible change that she detected through the movement of mirage waves visible in her scope. The temperature was rising as well, causing the air density to decrease and potentially affecting her bullet's trajectory. These microscopic variations meant nothing to casual observers, but they were the difference between success and failure at extreme distances. Another perfect hit marked her scorecard as the 1,000-meter target resonated with the impact. Elena's breathing remained controlled and rhythmic, her heart rate steady despite the growing pressure of an increasingly difficult course. She had learned to compartmentalize stress during her combat deployments, focusing entirely on the technical aspects of each shot while pushing aside thoughts of consequences, expectations. The rifle's barrel was warming slightly from the fired rounds, a factor that would become increasingly important as the string progressed. Elena monitored the barrel temperature through a small infrared thermometer clipped to her equipment belt. Excessive heat could change the barrel's harmonic characteristics and affect accuracy. She had calculated the optimal firing pace to maintain consistency while preventing overheating, another variable that separated expert marksmen from merely competent ones. 1,200 meters brought the first truly challenging target of the sequence. At this distance, the margin for error shrank dramatically. A mistaken wind reading of just 2 miles per hour could result in a complete miss. The bullet's flight time stretched to nearly 2 seconds, enough for wind conditions to change multiple times during the projectile's journey. Elena's spotting scope revealed heat waves beginning to dance across the valley floor as the desert warmed, creating optical distortion that made precise aiming more difficult. Her third shot required a more complex wind call. The flags near the fondo firing line indicated a gentle breeze from the left, but those positioned halfway to the target showed variable conditions. Elena studied the mirage patterns visible through her scope, learning to read the atmosphere like a book written in shimmering air. The mirage waves tilted slightly to the right, indicating wind movement different from what the flag suggested. She split the difference in her hold-off, trusting her ability to read conditions that weren't visible through conventional means. The bullet's impact came with the same satisfying ring of steel, but Elena noticed the hit was slightly left of center, not enough to cost points, but a deviation that provided valuable feedback about the wind conditions. She made a mental note to adjust her reading for the next target, filing away another piece of data in the vast library of shooting knowledge she had accumulated over years of practice. Target 4 waited at 1,500 meters, officially entering what most consider extreme long-range territory. The steel plate appeared impossibly small through her scope, barely larger than the reticle itself. Elena's calculations now required her to account for the Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth beneath the bullet's flight path. At this distance and latitude, the spinning planet would deflect her bullet slightly to the right, requiring a compensation that many shooters never learned to calculate. The mathematics of extreme-range shooting fascinated Elena in ways that her instructors had initially found surprising. She approached each shot like an engineering problem, considering variables that ranged from ammunition temperature to barometric pressure. Her shooting notebook contained pages of formulas and calculations developed through careful testing and verified through thousands of rounds fired under varying conditions. The science behind precision shooting was as beautiful to her as the art of executing a perfect shot. Her scope turrets clicked through another series of adjustments. VOOP. Elevation now requiring significant compensation for bullet drop. Elena's muscle memory guided her hands through the process, but her mind double-checked every setting. A single click error at this distance would result in a miss by several inches. The wind reading became even more critical with multiple layers of atmosphere potentially affecting the bullet's path in different ways. The fourth shot broke with the same perfect trigger control that had characterized every shot in Elena's military career. Through her scope, she watched the bullet's vapor trail arc across the desert sky, a barely visible line that disappeared and reappeared as atmospheric conditions bent the light. The flight time seemed eternal, almost 3 seconds of waiting while physics and preparation combined to determine the outcome. The steel target at 1,500 meters rang with authority, but Elena barely registered the sound. Her mind was already calculating the trajectory for target 5, Positioned at 1,800 meters in a location specifically chosen to challenge even the most skilled marksman. The shot placement on target 4 had been slightly high, indicating that the desert air was thinner than her ballistic computer had predicted. She adjusted her atmospheric readings accordingly, compensating for the elevation and temperature. Variations that could make or break the remaining shots. This qualification course represented more than personal achievement for Elena. Success here would shatter the gender barrier that had kept women out of official sniper schools for decades. The Marine Corps had finally opened all combat roles to women 2 years earlier, but institutional resistance remained strong. Many senior officers still believed that female Marines lacked the physical and mental attributes necessary for precision shooting under combat conditions. Elena's performance today would either validate their concerns or force them to confront their own prejudices. The observation tower behind her position held more than just range officials and scoring judges. Major General Patricia Morrison, the highest-ranking female officer in the Marine Corps, had flown in specifically to witness this attempt. Morrison understood the political implications of Elena's performance better than anyone. A successful completion of this course would not only establish Elena as the finest marksman in the Corps, but would also open sniper training to every qualified female Marine who followed. Elena's commanding officer, Colonel James Hartwell, stood beside the general with obvious tension in his posture. Hartwell had initially opposed Elena's assignment to sniper training, arguing that the physical demands would prove insurmountable. Her success had forced him to reevaluate his position, but he remained skeptical about women in direct combat roles. Today's performance would either vindicate his support for Elena's advancement or provide ammunition for his continuing doubts about female snipers. The current course record of 87% had been set by Gunnery Sergeant Michael Torres, a legendary marksman with 4 combat deployments and over 200 confirmed kills. Torres himself sat in the observation tower, having specifically requested permission to witness Elena's attempt. His record had stood for 3 years, surviving challenges from the Marine Corps' most elite shooters. Torres had publicly stated that no woman possessed the combination of strength, patience, and killer instinct necessary to surpass his mark. Elena's shooting partner, Corporal Chun, understood the magnitude of what was unfolding better than most observers. His initial skepticism about female snipers had been completely erased during their months of training together. Elena's consistency under pressure exceeded anything he had witnessed from male shooters, including several who had achieved legendary status within the sniper community. Chun's spotting calls would be crucial for the remaining targets, providing wind readings and impact observations that could make the difference between success and failure. The stakes extended beyond military recognition to the civilian shooting community as well. Women comprised less than 10% of competitive precision shooters, facing constant questions about their ability to compete at the highest levels. Elena's military record had already attracted attention from civilian shooting organizations, with several major competitions extending invitations contingent on her completion of military requirements. Success today would establish her as a trailblazer in both military and civilian marksmanship. Media representatives from major military publications had gathered to document the attempt, understanding that they were potentially witnessing a historic moment. The story of Elena's rise through the ranks had already generated significant interest, but completing this qualification would transform her from an interesting anomaly into a genuine barrier-breaking pioneer. The photographs and articles produced today would either celebrate a triumph or document a near miss that validated existing prejudices. Target 5 at 1,800 meters represented the point where atmospheric conditions became the primary challenge rather than simple marksmanship mechanics. The bullet's flight time approached 2.5 seconds, enough for wind conditions to change dramatically during the projectile's journey. Elena's scope revealed heat mirage beginning to intensify as the desert floor absorbed more solar radiation. The dancing air would make precise aiming increasingly difficult with each subsequent target. Her ballistic calculations now required accounting for variables that most shooters never encountered. The bullet would drop over 15 feet during its flight, following a parabolic arc that demanded precise elevation adjustments. Wind drift calculations became complex three-dimensional problems, considering not just crosswind components, but also vertical air movement caused by thermal columns rising from the heated desert floor. Elena's notebook contained pages of environmental data collected during similar conditions, providing reference points for her current calculations. The rifle's barrel temperature had stabilized within optimal parameters, warm enough for consistent powder burn, but not hot enough to affect accuracy. Elena's pacing between shots had been carefully planned to maintain this thermal equilibrium throughout the course. Too rapid a firing sequence would cause precision to degrade as the barrel overheated. Too slow would allow the barrel to cool inconsistently, changing the rifle's point of impact unpredictably. Elena's personal motivation extended beyond proving her capabilities to skeptical superiors. Growing up in East Los Angeles, she had been told repeatedly that girls didn't belong in military combat roles. Her high school JROTC instructor had discouraged her interest in marksmanship, suggesting she pursue more traditionally feminine military specialties. Elena's father, a Vietnam veteran, had initially opposed her military service entirely, believing that combat was no place for women, regardless of their capabilities. The technical challenge of the remaining targets would test every aspect of Elena's training and natural ability. Target 6 waited at 2,000 meters, positioned at the absolute limit of her rifle's effective range. The .338 Lapua Magnum cartridge was theoretically capable of accuracy at this distance, but environmental factors would play a larger role than equipment specifications. Success would require perfect execution of fundamentals combined with precise reading of atmospheric conditions. Elena's spotting scope revealed the target as little more than a gray dot against the desert backdrop. At this distance, the steel plate subtended less than half a minute of angle in her scope, smaller than the reticle itself. Aiming would become as much about mathematical calculation as visual alignment, requiring her to use reference points and measured holes rather than simply placing crosshairs on target center. The pressure of observation had transformed the familiar routine of precision shooting into something approaching performance art. Elena's every movement was being analyzed by experts who understood the technical challenges she faced. Her breathing, technique, body position, and trigger control were being evaluated by marksmen whose own reputations rested on their ability to perform under similar pressure. The weight of their expectations was something she had learned to channel into heightened focus rather than allowing it to create debilitating stress. Corporal Chun's wind reading responsibilities became increasingly critical as the range extended. His spotting scope allowed him to observe bullet traces and impact points invisible to Elena through her shooting scope. The partnership between shooter and spotter required absolute trust and communication, with split-second decisions potentially determining the outcome of each shot. Chun's reputation would be partially defined by his performance today, motivating him to provide the most accurate environmental readings possible. The mathematics of extreme-range shooting demanded calculations that pushed the limits of both ballistic software and human comprehension. Elena's smartphone contained multiple ballistic applications, but she had learned to verify their outputs through manual calculations that accounted for variables the software might miss. Air density variations caused by altitude and temperature changes could affect bullet trajectories in ways that weren't always captured by standard ballistic models. Elena's rifle had been specifically configured for this qualification attempt, with every component selected and adjusted to maximize accuracy potential. The custom barrel had been stress-relieved and cryogenically treated to minimize thermal expansion. The trigger had been fitted with a specialized spring system that provided consistent break weight regardless of temperature variations. Even her ammunition had been hand-loaded to precise specifications, with bullet weights sorted to within half a grain and powder charges measured to the nearest tenth of a grain. The wind shifted without warning as Elena prepared for the 1,800-meter shot, transforming from a gentle cross breeze into an erratic pattern of gusts and lulls that defied prediction. The flags positioned along the range began dancing in conflicting directions, some hanging limp while others snapped taut with sudden force. Heat waves rose from the desert floor in violent shimmers that made the distant target appear to swim through liquid glass. What had begun as ideal shooting conditions was deteriorating into a marksman's nightmare. Elena's body had been motionless for over 2 hours, and the prolonged static position was beginning to exact its toll. Her left knee, compressed against the hard sandstone, sent sharp signals of protest up her leg. The rifle's bipod legs had dug small depressions into the rock beneath her elbows, creating pressure points that would leave bruises for weeks. Her shooting hand had developed a slight tremor from maintaining grip tension, a barely perceptible shake that could translate into inches of error at extreme range. The sun climbed higher above the eastern mountains, transforming the crisp morning air into a furnace of rising thermals and unpredictable air currents. Elena's ghillie suit, perfectly suited for concealment and temperature regulation in cool conditions, now trapped heat against her body like a wool blanket. Sweat began forming beneath her eye protection, threatening to drip into her scope and blur her vision at the most critical moment. She couldn't afford to break position to wipe it away. A technical malfunction threatened to end her record attempt before the most challenging shots could be attempted. The ballistic computer clipped to her belt began displaying error messages as its internal temperature sensors registered readings outside normal operating parameters. The device that had calculated precise firing solutions for the first 5 targets was now providing conflicting data that could lead to catastrophic misses on the remaining shots. Elena would need to rely entirely on manual calculations and environmental reading skills developed through years of practice. Radio chatter from the observation tower crackled through her earpiece with increasing frequency as range officials coordinated with meteorological specialists monitoring atmospheric conditions. The wind measuring equipment positioned throughout the valley was registering gusts exceeding 20 miles per hour, approaching the upper limit of safe firing conditions for precision shooting. Several officials recommended postponing the qualification attempt until more favorable weather returned, but Elena knew this might be her only opportunity for months. Elena's shooting position had been carefully selected for optimal sight lines to all targets, but the changing environmental conditions revealed its vulnerabilities. The rocky outcrop that provided excellent concealment and stable support now became a heat collector that generated its own thermal currents. The warm stone beneath her body created rising air columns that deflected her scope's view, making the distant targets appear to dance unpredictably. What had seemed like the perfect sniper's nest was transforming into a thermal furnace. Corporal Chun struggled with his own equipment challenges as his spotting scope fogged repeatedly from temperature differentials between the cool morning air and the rapidly heating desert floor. His ability to provide accurate wind readings and impact observations was compromised by the atmospheric distortion that made precise observation nearly impossible. The partnership between shooter and spotter that had functioned flawlessly during practice sessions was being tested by conditions neither had encountered during training. The rifle barrel's temperature began climbing beyond optimal parameters despite Elena's careful pacing between shots. The precision machined steel was absorbing solar radiation in addition to heat generated by fired rounds, threatening to expand in ways that could shift the point of impact unpredictably. Elena monitored the barrel temperature through her infrared thermometer, knowing that excessive heat could destroy the accuracy she had worked months to achieve. She needed to fire faster to complete the course before conditions deteriorated further. But haste would compromise the precision required for success. Elena's hydration system had malfunctioned earlier that morning, leaving her with only a single water bottle to sustain her through the qualification attempt. The rising temperature and physical stress of maintaining shooting position for hours was accelerating dehydration that could affect her cognitive function and motor control. Her mouth felt increasingly dry, and she could sense the early stages of heat exhaustion beginning to affect her concentration. Medical personnel in the observation tower monitored her condition through high-powered optics, ready to call a safety halt if she showed signs of serious heat injury. Equipment failure struck Elena's backup communication system as the radio battery died without warning, leaving her dependent on hand signals with her spotter for critical information exchanges. The loss of radio contact with range officials meant she could no longer receive updated weather information or safety warnings that might prevent injury or equipment damage. She was now isolated on the ridge with degrading environmental conditions, and no reliable means of calling for assistance if the situation became dangerous. The custom-loaded ammunition that Elena had prepared specifically for this qualification was showing signs of temperature sensitivity as the cartridges heated in her rifle's chamber. Powder temperatures exceeding design parameters could increase pressures beyond safe limits, while simultaneously changing muzzle velocities that would throw off her carefully calculated trajectories. Each round now represented a calculated risk between maintaining her shooting schedule and potentially damaging her rifle or injuring herself through overpressure conditions. Photography equipment operated by media representatives was beginning to fail in the extreme heat, with several cameras shutting down automatically to prevent internal damage. The historical record of Elena's achievement was being compromised by the same environmental conditions that threatened her performance. Military photographers with heat-resistant equipment continued documenting the attempt, but the civilian media presence was rapidly diminishing as their gear succumbed to desert conditions. Elena's shooting glasses fogged repeatedly as moisture from her exhalations condensed on the cool lenses, forcing her to clean them between shots with movements that compromised her shooting position. The anti-fog coating applied to her eye protection was failing under the extreme temperature differential between her heated face and the relatively cool morning air. Clear vision was essential for the precision required at extreme range, but maintaining it required position breaks that affected her natural point of aim. The wind measuring equipment positioned near the final targets began malfunctioning as electronic components overheated in the direct solar radiation. Range officials lost their most accurate source of environmental data, just as Elena prepared for the shots that would require the most precise wind calculations. She was now entirely dependent on visual wind reading techniques and her own experience, interpreting atmospheric conditions that were changing faster than measurement equipment could track. Thermal currents rising from the heated desert floor began creating powerful updrafts that could lift a bullet several inches above its intended trajectory. Elena watched through her scope as mirage patterns shifted from horizontal waves to vertical columns, indicating air movement that could unpredictably affect her remaining shots. The atmospheric conditions that had favored precision shooting were transforming into a chaotic environment that would challenge even the most experienced marksman. Elena's water supply was nearly exhausted, with less than 6 ounces remaining in her bottle. The combination of physical exertion, equipment heat generation, and rising air temperature was accelerating her fluid loss beyond what she had anticipated during mission planning. Dehydration was beginning to affect her fine motor control, introducing a slight tremor that could prove catastrophic during trigger manipulation. She faced the choice between maintaining her shooting schedule and taking the time necessary to properly hydrate between shots. The rifle scope's internal mechanisms were beginning to show signs of thermal expansion as the instrument heated beyond its design specifications. Elena noticed slight changes in reticle alignment that indicated the scope's internals were shifting, position relative to the tube walls. The precision optical instrument that had performed flawlessly during testing was now introducing variables that could affect point of impact by several inches at extreme range. She would need to verify zero between shots while compensating for ongoing thermal drift. Elena's earpiece crackled with urgent static before falling completely silent. The final link to range safety personnel severed by electronic failure caused by the extreme heat. She tapped the device twice, hoping to restore contact, but received only the hollow echo of dead circuits. The isolation was complete. Now no communication with spotters, no weather updates from meteorological stations, no safety coordination with range officials. She was alone on the ridge with 6 targets remaining, and conditions that would challenge the limits of both equipment and human capability. A helicopter appeared on the horizon without warning, its rotor wash visible as a distortion in the heated air miles away. The aircraft wasn't part of the planned range operations, and its flight path would take it directly between Elena's position and the remaining targets. The pilot was either unaware of the ongoing qualification or had received emergency orders that superseded range safety protocols. Elena watched through her scope as the helicopter's downdraft began affecting wind patterns across the entire valley, creating chaotic air currents that would make precision shooting nearly impossible. Rifle's action had begun sticking slightly as thermal expansion affected the precisely machined bolt surfaces. Elena worked the bolt carefully, feeling increased resistance that hadn't been present during the cooler morning hours. Sand particles, lifted by the thermal updrafts and helicopter rotor wash, were beginning to infiltrate her weapon system despite her careful maintenance procedures. The precision instrument that had cycled smoothly for thousands of rounds was now showing signs of environmental contamination that could cause a catastrophic malfunction at the worst possible moment. Elena's shooting position was being compromised by the heating rock beneath her body. The sandstone that had provided stable support was now radiating heat that created visible distortion waves between her muzzle and the targets. She could actually see her own heat signature rising from the rifle barrel and her exposed equipment, creating atmospheric turbulence that would deflect bullets unpredictably. Moving to a different position would require re-zeroing her rifle and recalculating all her environmental factors, potentially ending her record attempt. The emergency medical team in the observation tower began showing signs of concern as they monitored Elena's condition through high-powered optics. Her movements were becoming slightly less fluid, indicating the early stages of heat exhaustion that could progress rapidly in the extreme conditions. Military protocol required immediate evacuation if heat injury symptoms became apparent, but Elena showed no obvious distress signals that would justify intervention. The medical personnel faced the difficult decision of when to prioritize safety over mission completion. Corporal Chun's spotting scope had fogged completely despite repeated cleaning attempts, leaving him unable to provide the critical wind readings and impact observations that Elena needed for the remaining shots. His backup optical equipment was stored in the observation tower, too far away to retrieve without abandoning his spotting position. Elena was now completely dependent on her own environmental reading skills and shooting instincts, forced to make decisions based solely on information available through her primary scope. The helicopter's approach triggered an unexpected safety protocol activation that automatically locked down certain range equipment. Electronic wind measuring devices throughout the valley shut off to prevent electromagnetic interference with aircraft navigation systems. The sophisticated environmental monitoring network that had provided precise atmospheric data was now offline, leaving Elena without the technical support that modern precision shooting typically required. She would need to rely entirely on visual wind reading techniques that most contemporary marksmen had never fully developed. Elena's custom ammunition was showing signs of pressure variations as the cartridges heated beyond their design specifications. The carefully hand-loaded rounds that had delivered perfect consistency during testing were now experiencing powder temperature fluctuations that could change muzzle velocities by 50 feet per second or more. Such variations would throw off her trajectory calculations by several feet at extreme range, potentially causing complete misses regardless of her shooting technique. Each remaining shot was now a calculated gamble with ammunition that might not perform as expected. The ghillie suit that had provided perfect camouflage was becoming a liability as synthetic materials began retaining heat far beyond their design limits. Elena could feel the fabric becoming uncomfortably warm against her skin, creating a microclimate that was accelerating her dehydration and affecting her ability to maintain steady position. Removing the camouflage would improve her thermal regulation, but would also make her visible to any observers who might compromise range safety or interfere with her shooting sequence. Dust devils began forming spontaneously across the valley floor as heated air created vertical columns of rotating atmosphere. Elena watched through her scope as the miniature tornadoes marched randomly across the range, their chaotic movement impossible to predict or compensate for in her ballistic calculations. If one of these dust columns passed between her position and a target during a shot, it could deflect her bullet by several feet in any direction. She would need to time her shots to avoid the unpredictable atmospheric phenomena. The observation tower's air conditioning system failed under the extreme load, forcing officials and observers into the same brutal heat that Elena was experiencing. Several VIP observers departed the tower, unable to tolerate conditions that Elena had endured for hours while maintaining precision shooting position. Major General Morrison remained at her post, understanding that leaving would send the wrong message about female resilience under adverse conditions. Her presence provided moral support even though Elena couldn't see the tower from her shooting position. Elena's rifle scope began showing signs of internal fogging as temperature differentials between the instrument's interior and exterior created condensation on internal lens surfaces. The precision optical system that had provided crystal-clear target resolution was now developing a slight haze that made precise aiming increasingly difficult. Clearing the condensation would require disassembling the scope, effectively ending her qualification attempt. She would need to compensate for decreased optical clarity while maintaining the same precision standards required for record-breaking performance. The ballistic computer's failure had forced Elena to rely on manual calculations that consumed precious time between shots. Her waterproof notebook contained backup trajectory tables, but the data wasn't specific to current atmospheric conditions or her exact ammunition specifications. She was essentially performing mathematical interpolation in her head while managing equipment failures and extreme environmental stress. The mental workload was approaching levels that could compromise her physical shooting performance. Water shortage was becoming critical as Elena's remaining fluid supply dropped below emergency reserve levels. The combination of physical exertion, equipment-generated heat, and rising air temperature was accelerating her dehydration faster than she had experienced during combat deployments in desert environments. Her cognitive function was beginning to show subtle signs of impairment that could affect the complex decision-making required for extreme-range shooting. She faced the choice between completing her qualification attempt and maintaining safe physiological function. Range safety personnel were growing increasingly concerned about Elena's isolation and the deteriorating conditions, but military protocol prevented them from intervening without clear evidence of immediate danger. The qualification attempt was proceeding within technical safety parameters, but the cumulative effect of multiple environmental and equipment challenges was creating a situation that hadn't been anticipated during range planning. Officials found themselves in the unprecedented position of monitoring a potentially historic achievement while managing risks that exceeded their previous experience. The helicopter's flight pattern had stabilized into a holding pattern that would keep it in the area for an extended period, continuing to disrupt atmospheric conditions throughout the valley. Elena realized that waiting for the aircraft to depart might mean losing the qualification opportunity entirely as heat conditions became unsurvivable. She would need to complete her remaining shots while compensating for the additional atmospheric turbulence created by rotor wash effects that were beyond her previous experience or training. Elena's hands showed the first signs of heat-induced tremor as her core temperature began rising beyond optimal levels. The minute muscle movements that were invisible during normal conditions became magnified through the rifle's scope, creating apparent target movement that wasn't actually occurring. She would need to time her trigger brakes to coincide with natural tremor pauses while maintaining the same precision standards that had characterized her previous shots. The margin for error was disappearing. Just as the technical challenges reached their peak difficulty, Elena made the calculation in seconds that would define the remainder of her qualification attempt. With 6 targets remaining and conditions deteriorating exponentially, she could either maintain her methodical pace and risk complete mission failure as equipment and environmental factors overwhelmed her position, or accelerate her firing sequence and accept reduced precision in exchange for completing the course before conditions became impossible. Neither option guaranteed success, but continuing at her current pace guaranteed failure. The decision triggered a fundamental shift in her shooting approach. Instead of the careful deliberation that had characterized her first 5 shots, Elena now needed to rely on instinctive shooting skills developed through thousands of rounds fired under combat stress. Her muscle memory would need to compensate for calculations that she no longer had time to perform manually. The mathematical precision that had driven her training would give way to the intuitive marksmanship that separated true snipers from technical shooters. Target 6 at 2,000 meters appeared through her scope as little more than a heat-distorted shimmer against the desert backdrop. The steel plate was barely visible through the atmospheric turbulence, appearing to dance randomly as thermal currents bent the light between Elena's position and the target. She had perhaps 30 seconds to acquire the target, calculate her hold, and fire before the helicopter's rotor wash created additional atmospheric chaos that would make the shot impossible. Elena's breathing shifted into combat rhythm, the rapid but controlled pattern that she had used during firefights in Afghanistan. Her heart rate increased to match the accelerated timeline, pumping oxygenated blood to muscles that would need to perform with mechanical precision under extreme time pressure. The calm meditative state that had characterized her morning shooting was replaced by the heightened awareness that accompanied life or death decisions in combat environments. The rifle's bolt operated with increasing difficulty as sand particles infiltrated the action despite her protective measures. Elena felt the bolt catch slightly as she chambered the 6th round, requiring additional force to achieve full battery. The precision mechanism that had functioned flawlessly for thousands of cycles was now operating at the edge of malfunction. She couldn't afford to hesitate or second-guess the rifle's reliability, but each subsequent shot carried the risk of a complete mechanical failure that would end her attempt. Corporal Chun abandoned his useless spotting scope and began providing wind calls based on visual observation of terrain features and heat mirage patterns. His voice carried the tension of a man watching his partner attempt something that defied reasonable expectations under impossible conditions. Chun understood that Elena was now shooting beyond the limits of equipment and environmental conditions. Relying purely on skills that couldn't be taught in any training program, the helicopter pilot finally became aware of the range operation below and began a banking turn that would take the aircraft away from the target area. But the maneuver created a massive rotor wash effect that swept across the valley like an invisible tsunami, disturbing dust and debris throughout the range. Elena watched through her scope as the wind flags throughout the valley began spinning. frantically in conflicting directions, indicating atmospheric chaos that would challenge the most sophisticated ballistic calculations. Elena's scope reticle wavered slightly as heat exhaustion began affecting her fine motor control. The crosshairs that had remained rock-steady throughout the morning now showed microscopic movement that could translate into inches of error at extreme range. She compensated by using her breathing pattern to time the shot, waiting for the natural respiratory pause when her body achieved momentary stillness. The technique required splitting her attention between target acquisition and physiological timing. The ammunition in Elena's magazine was heating beyond safe temperatures as the rifle absorbed solar radiation and heat from fired rounds. She could feel the warmth radiating from the cartridges through the magazine walls, indicating that powder temperatures were approaching levels that could create dangerous overpressure conditions. Each shot now carried the risk of equipment damage or personal injury, but stopping to cool the ammunition would mean losing the qualification opportunity entirely. Elena's water supply was now critically low, with less than 2 ounces remaining in her bottle. The symptoms of moderate dehydration were becoming apparent in her decreased cognitive function and increased reaction time. Her decision-making process was slowing just as the situation demanded faster responses to rapidly changing conditions. She faced the choice between taking time to hydrate properly and maintaining the shooting pace necessary to complete the qualification before conditions became impossible. The rifle scope's internal condensation was worsening as temperature differentials increased throughout the optical system. Elena's target image was becoming increasingly hazy, forcing her to use peripheral vision and scope edge clarity to maintain precise aiming. The sophisticated optical instrument that had cost more than most cars was now providing image quality comparable to basic hunting scopes. She would need to compensate for reduced optical performance while maintaining record setting accuracy standards. Range officials in the observation tower faced their own critical decisions as they monitored Elena's condition and the deteriorating environmental factors. Military protocol provided guidelines for halting operations due to safety concerns, but Elena's situation fell into gray areas where judgment calls could determine whether she made history or suffered heat injury. The officials understood that intervening prematurely would end Elena's qualification attempt, but waiting too long could result in serious medical consequences. Elena's ghillie suit was now retaining so much heat that it was creating a personal microclimate that accelerated her physiological stress. The camouflage that had been essential for concealment was now actively working against her performance and safety. Removing portions of the suit would improve her thermal regulation, but would also make her visible to any observers who might compromise range safety. She made the decision to partially disrobe, accepting increased visibility in exchange for improved performance capability. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The wind measuring equipment throughout the valley had either malfunctioned due to heat or been shut down for aircraft safety, leaving Elena without any technical environmental data for her remaining shots. She was now entirely dependent on visual wind reading techniques that required interpreting heat mirage patterns, vegetation movement, and dust drift indicators. The sophisticated environmental monitoring that characterized modern precision shooting was no longer available, forcing her to rely on skills that most contemporary marksmen had never developed. Elena's rifle barrel temperature was now approaching levels that could affect accuracy through thermal expansion and harmonic changes. The precision machined steel was expanding in ways that could shift her point of impact unpredictably between shots. She monitored the barrel temperature through her infrared thermometer, while calculating the optimal firing pace to complete her qualification before thermal effects destroyed her accuracy. The margin between shooting fast enough to finish and shooting slow enough to maintain precision was disappearing. the observation tower's sophisticated camera equipment was beginning to fail as electronic components overheated in the extreme conditions. The photographic record of Elena's historic attempt was being compromised by the same environmental factors that threatened her performance. Military photographers with heat-resistant equipment continued documenting the qualification, but the quality and quantity of imagery was declining as conditions exceeded equipment design specifications. Elena's shooting position was becoming untenable as the heated rock beneath her body created thermal currents that distorted her sight picture. She could see her own heat signature rising from her equipment and body, creating atmospheric turbulence that would affect bullet trajectory unpredictably. Moving to a different position would require re-zeroing her rifle and starting her environmental calculations from scratch, effectively ending her record attempt. She would need to complete her qualification from a position that was actively working against her. Success. The mental workload of compensating for multiple simultaneous equipment failures and environmental challenges was approaching levels that could overwhelm Elena's cognitive capacity. She was simultaneously calculating trajectories without ballistic computer support, compensating for scope condensation, managing ammunition temperature concerns, monitoring her own physiological condition, and interpreting rapidly changing atmospheric conditions. The decision-making burden was reaching levels that exceeded what she had experienced during the most intense combat situations. Elena chambered her sixth round and settled into the shooting position that would determine whether months of preparation had been sufficient to overcome impossible conditions. The target at 2,000 meters was barely visible through the atmospheric distortion and scope condensation, but she had committed to completing the qualification regardless of equipment limitations or environmental challenges. Her trigger finger found its position as she prepared to test the absolute limits of both her equipment and her abilities. Elena's breathing entered the zone that existed beyond conscious control, where physiological responses synchronized with mental focus to create a state of heightened awareness that few humans ever experienced. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously as her perception shifted into the hyper-focused mode that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. The chaos of environmental factors and equipment failures faded into background noise as her mind locked onto the single task that would define her military career and personal legacy. The crosshairs found the 2,000-meter target through a haze of condensation and atmospheric distortion that transformed precision aiming into an exercise in calculated faith. Elena's scope reticle wavered slightly from the heat-induced tremor in her hands, but her years of combat experience had taught her to fire between the tremors. Finding those microscopic moments when her body achieved perfect stillness, she held her breath not to steady her aim, but to time the natural pause in her respiratory cycle when even her heartbeat couldn't disturb the rifle's alignment. The trigger broke with crystalline clarity, the custom mechanism responding to exactly 2.5 pounds of pressure applied straight back without lateral movement. Elena's follow-through was automatic, maintaining sight picture and trigger pressure for a full second after the shot while watching the bullet's vapor trail arc across the desert sky. The recoil felt different in the extreme heat, the rifle's response slightly sluggish from thermal expansion in the stock and action components. She cycled the bolt immediately, knowing that hesitation would allow doubt to creep into her decision-making process. 3 seconds of flight. Time felt like an eternity as physics and preparation combined to determine the outcome. Elena watched through her scope as the bullet trace disappeared and reappeared in the shimmering air, following a trajectory that carried months of training and years of dreams toward a target that seemed impossibly distant. The sound of impact came as a sharp crack rather than the musical ring of earlier targets, indicating that the bullet had struck steel, but possibly not in the scoring zone. Corporal Chun's voice cut through the heat-distorted air with professional precision despite the stress evident in his tone. Hit. Lower right edge, still scoring. The confirmation meant that Elena's sixth shot had found its mark, despite conditions that would have defeated most marksmen. But the impact location warned her that atmospheric effects were pushing her bullets in ways that her calculations hadn't fully predicted. She would need to adjust her holdoffs for the remaining targets. Based on this new data point, Target 7 waited at 2,100 meters, positioned at a distance where the curvature of the Earth began to affect bullet trajectory immeasurable ways. Elena's mental calculations now required accounting for the Coriolis effect, the planet's rotation beneath her bullet's flight path that would deflect the projectile by several inches at this range. The mathematics involved exceeded what most marksmen ever learned to calculate, demanding an understanding of physics that went far beyond basic ballistics. Elena's rifle action was now operating with noticeable friction as sand particles worked their way into the precisely machined surfaces despite her protective measures. She felt the bolt catch momentarily as she chambered the seventh round, requiring additional force to achieve full lockup. The weapon that had cycled smoothly for thousands of rounds was now showing signs of environmental contamination that could cause a complete malfunction at any moment. Each shot carried the risk of being her last if the rifle seized completely. The helicopter's departure had eliminated the direct rotor wash effects, but the atmospheric disturbance it had created continued to generate chaotic air currents throughout the valley. Elena could see dust devils forming spontaneously across the desert floor as heated air created vertical columns of rotating atmosphere that moved unpredictably across the range. She timed her shot to avoid the worst atmospheric turbulence, but the conditions changed faster than she could adapt her firing sequence. Elena's hydration level had dropped to dangerous levels, with her remaining water supply insufficient to maintain safe physiological function in the extreme heat. Her cognitive performance was beginning to show subtle signs of impairment that could affect the complex decision-making required for extreme-range shooting. Symptoms of heat exhaustion were becoming apparent in her decreased fine motor control and slightly delayed reaction times. She was now shooting at the edge of human performance capability while managing the early stages of heat injury. The seventh shot required Elena to use Kentucky windage, holding off the target rather than adjusting her scope turrets that might not track reliably in the extreme heat. She estimated the required compensation in her head, splitting the difference between multiple wind indicators that showed conflicting information about atmospheric conditions along the bullet's flight path. The hold looked wrong through her scope, with the crosshairs seemingly aimed several feet away from the target, but her experience told her to trust the calculations rather than visual instinct. Elena's trigger press felt different as dehydration affected her fine motor control, requiring conscious attention to maintain the straight back pressure that had become automatic through thousands of practice repetitions. The shot broke cleanly despite her physiological stress, but she could feel the subtle changes in her technique that indicated her body was operating at the limits of its capability. The rifle's recoil seemed sharper in the thin air, and she noticed that her natural point of aim was drifting slightly between shots. The bullet's flight time at 2,100 meters approached 3.5 seconds, enough for wind conditions to change dramatically during the projectile's journey. Elena watched through her scope as heat mirage patterns shifted and swirled, indicating atmospheric movement that could deflect her bullet by several feet in any direction. The target appeared to dance through the optical distortion, making precise aiming nearly impossible with conventional techniques. Impact confirmation came with the distinctive ring of steel, but Elena noticed that the sound seemed muffled by the atmospheric density changes caused by extreme heating. Corporal Chun's spot call indicated another scoring hit, but again on the edge of the target rather than center mass. The pattern told Elena that she was reading wind conditions correctly, but that thermal effects were creating vertical bullet displacement that she hadn't fully accounted for in her calculations. Target 8 at 2,200 meters represented the absolute limit of her rifle's effective range under ideal conditions. Current environmental factors pushed this shot beyond the edge of what was theoretically possible with her equipment and ammunition combination. Elena was now attempting to hit a target that was smaller than her scope's reticle at a distance, where bullet drop exceeded 15 feet and wind drift could approach several yards. Success would require perfect execution, combined with favorable atmospheric conditions that might not occur. Elena's rifle barrel temperature had climbed beyond optimal specifications, causing thermal expansion that could shift her point of impact. Unpredictably, she could feel heat radiating from the steel through her gloves, indicating temperatures that were affecting the barrel's harmonic characteristics. The precision machine tube that had delivered consistent accuracy was now operating outside its design parameters, introducing variables that couldn't be calculated or compensated for through technique alone. The scope's internal condensation had worsened to the point where Elena's target image was significantly degraded, forcing her to use peripheral vision and scope edge clarity to maintain any semblance of precise aiming. The sophisticated optical system was now providing image quality that would be considered unacceptable under normal circumstances. She was essentially aiming at a target she could barely see through an instrument that was failing to provide the optical clarity required for precision shooting. Elena's ammunition was now heating beyond safe temperatures as the rifle absorbed solar radiation that exceeded design specifications for both powder and projectile components. She could feel warmth radiating from the cartridges through the magazine walls, indicating that powder temperatures were approaching levels that could create dangerous overpressure conditions. Each shot carried increasing risk of equipment damage or personal injury, but stopping to cool the ammunition would end her qualification attempt. The mental calculations required for the 2,200-meter shot pushed Elena's cognitive capacity to its limits while simultaneously managing equipment failures and physiological stress. She was computing trajectory adjustments for bullet drop that exceeded the height of a 2-story building while compensating for wind effects that could push her bullet yards off target. The mathematical complexity exceeded what she had ever attempted under perfect conditions, let alone while managing heat exhaustion and equipment malfunctions. Elena chambered her 8th round with mechanical precision, despite the rifle's increasing reluctance to cycle smoothly. The bolt required noticeably more force to close completely, and she could feel sand particles grinding between precisely machined surfaces that had been engineered to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. She was now one shot away from either achieving the impossible or watching her dreams disappear in the desert heat. 2,200-meter target materialized through Elena's scope as little more than a gray suggestion against the heat-shimmered horizon, its edges blurred by atmospheric distortion that made precise aiming more art than science. At this distance, the steel plate subtended less than 1/4 minute of angle, smaller than her reticle's crosshair intersection. Elena's calculations told her to aim nearly 4 feet above the visible target to compensate for bullet drop that would exceed the height of a house during the projectile's 4-second flight time. Elena's body had achieved a state of physiological efficiency that bordered on the supernatural, her metabolic processes slowing to conserve energy while maintaining the muscle control necessary for precision shooting. Her heart rate had settled into a rhythm that provided optimal blood flow without creating tremor-inducing pulsation in her extremities. Even her breathing had become so shallow that it barely registered on thermal imaging equipment, her body automatically adjusting to minimize atmospheric disturbance around her rifle muzzle. The rifle's chamber was now hot enough to cook ammunition beyond safe specifications, but Elena had committed to completing her qualification regardless of equipment limitations or safety margins. She could feel heat radiating through the receiver into her cheek as she settled into position for the 8th shot. The steel components were expanding in ways that would shift her rifle's zero unpredictably, forcing her to compensate for thermal drift that couldn't be calculated with mathematical precision. Atmospheric conditions had stabilized into patterns that Elena could read through years of experience, interpreting environmental factors invisible to most observers. The heat mirage rising from the desert floor created consistent distortion patterns that she used as wind indicators, reading the atmosphere like a weather map written in shimmering air. Dust particles suspended in the thermal columns provided additional data about air movement at different altitudes along her bullet's trajectory. Elena's mental state had transcended the normal boundaries between conscious thought and instinctive reaction, entering a zone where complex ballistic calculations occurred below the threshold of awareness. Her mind processed windage corrections, elevation adjustments, and timing factors without the deliberate calculation that had characterized her earlier shots. The integration of technical knowledge with intuitive marksmanship represented the highest level of snipercraft that few marksmen ever achieved. The 8th round was chambered with deliberate care as Elena felt increased resistance in the rifle's bolt action. Sand particles had infiltrated the precisely machined surfaces despite her protective measures, creating friction that threatened to jam the weapon completely. She could feel the bolt catch slightly at full closure, requiring additional force to achieve the lockup necessary for safe firing. Each subsequent shot carried increasing risk of mechanical failure that would end her qualification attempt. Elena's scope reticle danced slightly from heat-induced tremor in her hands, but her shooting technique had evolved beyond dependence on perfect stillness. She timed her trigger press to coincide with natural movement patterns, firing during microscopic moments when her body's motion aligned with optimal shot placement. The skill required reading her own physiological rhythms while simultaneously interpreting atmospheric conditions that changed faster than conscious thought could process. The trigger broke with mechanical precision despite Elena's degraded fine motor control from dehydration and heat stress. Her follow-through was automatic, maintaining sight picture and trigger pressure while watching the bullet trace arc across the desert sky like a barely visible thread connecting her position to the distant target. The rifle's recoil felt harsh against her shoulder as thermal expansion in the stock materials changed the weapon's balance and handling characteristics. 4 seconds of flight time stretched into eternity as Elena watched physics and preparation combined to determine whether months of training had been sufficient to overcome impossible conditions. The bullet's vapor trail appeared and disappeared through atmospheric layers that bent light and redirected projectiles in ways that defied precise calculation. She could see the projectile's path curving downward as gravity claimed its inevitable victory over velocity and momentum. The impact sound came as a sharp crack that echoed across the valley with authority, confirming that steel had met lead at a distance that challenged the fundamental limits of rifle accuracy. Elena's scope was too condensation fogged to reveal impact location, forcing her to rely on Corporal Chun's spotting call for confirmation of hit or miss. The seconds before his assessment felt longer than the bullet's flight time, containing the difference between achievement and failure. Dead center hit. Chun's voice cut through the superheated air with excitement that he couldn't suppress despite his professional demeanor. The confirmation meant that Elena had successfully engaged a target at a distance where most rifles couldn't even reach, let alone achieve precision hits. But 3 targets remained, each positioned at distances that pushed beyond the theoretical limits of her equipment and ammunition combination. Elena's rifle action was now operating with significant difficulty as thermal expansion and sand contamination combined to create mechanical challenges that threatened complete weapon failure. The bolt required substantial force to cycle, and she could hear grinding sounds that indicated accelerated wear on precision surfaces. She was essentially operating a weapon that was destroying itself with each shot, racing against mechanical failure to complete her qualification. Target 9 at 2,300 meters existed at the very edge of visibility, through Elena's degraded optical system. The steel plate appeared as little more than a heat-induced mirage, its outline blending with atmospheric distortion until it seemed to exist more in memory than reality. Elena's ballistic calculations now required accounting for variables that exceeded the design parameters of her ballistic computer, forcing her to rely on manual calculations that pushed her mathematical abilities to their limits. Elena's hydration level had reached critically low levels where cognitive function was noticeably impaired, but her muscle memory continued operating with mechanical precision developed through thousands of practice repetitions. Her body was performing complex motor functions while her conscious mind struggled with the mathematical calculations required for extreme-range shooting. The dissociation between physical performance and mental capacity created a surreal shooting experience where success depended more on instinct than conscious control. The ninth round was loaded with hands that showed visible tremor from heat exhaustion, but Elena's shooting technique had evolved to compensate for physiological limitations that would defeat less experienced marksmen. She used her breathing pattern to time the shot, waiting for natural pauses in her respiratory cycle when her body achieved momentary stillness despite the overall degradation in her motor control. The skill required integration of breathing, heartbeat, and trigger manipulation that operated below conscious awareness. Elena's scope had condensed to the point where target acquisition was more imagination than optical reality, forcing her to use reference points and mathematical holds rather than visual aiming techniques. She was essentially shooting at a target she couldn't see with a rifle that might not function, and ammunition that was operating beyond safe specifications. The shot represented pure faith in training and experience accumulated over years of precision shooting under conditions that ranged from ideal to impossible. The trigger press felt foreign under Elena's dehydrated fingers, requiring conscious attention to maintain the straight-back pressure that had become automatic through countless practice sessions. She could feel her technique degrading as physiological stress overwhelmed muscle memory, but her determination to complete the qualification pushed her beyond normal human limitations. The shot broke cleanly despite her compromised condition, sending another projectile toward a target that existed at the very limits of possibility. Elena watched the bullet trace disappear into atmospheric distortion that made tracking impossible. Through her degraded optics, trusting that physics and preparation would combine to place the projectile somewhere near her intended point of impact. The flight time exceeded 4 seconds, enough for wind conditions to change dramatically and affect bullet trajectory in ways that couldn't be predicted or compensated for through conventional techniques. The confirmation of another center hit came with disbelief that Elena couldn't allow herself to acknowledge while 2 targets remained. She had now successfully engaged 9 consecutive targets under conditions that would have defeated any marksman she had ever known. But the final 2 shots would test the absolute limits of human capability and equipment reliability. The rifle was nearly too hot to touch. Her ammunition was operating beyond safe parameters, and her body was showing signs of heat, injury that could progress rapidly in the extreme conditions. Elena's weapon had degraded from precision instrument to barely functional firearm as thermal expansion warped components beyond their design tolerances. The bolt now required her full strength to operate, grinding against surfaces that had been machined to thousandths of an inch precision but were now scored by sand particles and distorted by heat that exceeded metallurgical specifications. She could feel the receiver flexing slightly under the stress of thermal expansion, introducing variables into her rifle's performance that couldn't be calculated or compensated for through technique alone. The 10th target, positioned at 2,400 meters, represented a distance so extreme that atmospheric conditions became more significant than ballistic trajectory in determining bullet placement. Elena's projectile would spend nearly 5 seconds in flight, enough time for wind conditions to change completely along the bullet's path. The steel plate was invisible to her naked eye and barely perceptible through her condensation-fogged scope, appearing as little more than a theoretical point in space where mathematics suggested a target should exist. Elena's core body temperature had risen to levels that triggered automatic physiological responses designed to prevent heat stroke. But these protective mechanisms also compromised the fine motor control required for precision shooting. Her body was diverting blood flow away from extremities to protect vital organs, creating tremors in her hands that she had to time and compensate for rather than eliminate. The shaking wasn't fear or nervousness, but pure physiological stress. That would have ended most marksmen's attempts hours earlier. Medical personnel in the observation tower were now actively monitoring Elena's condition for signs of heat injury that would require immediate intervention, but military protocol prevented them from stopping the qualification without clear evidence of immediate danger. They watched through high-powered optics as Elena's movements became slightly less fluid, indicating heat exhaustion that could progress rapidly to heat stroke if conditions didn't improve. The officials faced the impossible choice between allowing her to continue pursuing history and protecting her from potentially life-threatening heat injury. The ammunition remaining in Elena's magazine was now operating at temperatures that created powder burn rates far exceeding manufacturer specifications, generating chamber pressures that could damage her rifle or cause catastrophic failure. Each shot carried increasing risk of overpressure conditions that could rupture the chamber or barrel, potentially causing serious injury to Elena or nearby personnel. She was essentially firing experimental ammunition under conditions that no reasonable safety protocol would permit. Elena's ballistic calculations for the 2,400-meter shot pushed the boundaries of mathematical possibility, requiring her to account for variables that most marksmen never encountered even at shorter ranges. The bullet would drop nearly 20 feet during its flight, following a parabolic arc that carried it far above the visible target, before gravity claimed its inevitable victory. Coriolis effects from the Earth's rotation would deflect the projectile several inches laterally, demanding compensation that required understanding physics principles beyond basic ballistics. The mental workload of performing complex calculations while managing equipment failures and physiological stress was approaching levels that could overwhelm Elena's cognitive capacity entirely. She was simultaneously computing trajectory adjustments for extreme bullet drop, compensating for scope condensation that degraded her sight picture, managing ammunition temperature concerns that affected powder burn rates, and interpreting atmospheric conditions that changed faster than her calculations could accommodate. The decision-making burden exceeded what she had experienced during the most intense combat situations. Elena's shooting position had become untenable as heated rock beneath her body created thermal currents that rose directly through her sight line, distorting her view of the target through visible heat waves. She could see her own thermal signature rising from her equipment and body, creating atmospheric turbulence that would affect bullet trajectory in unpredictable ways. The precision shooting position she had maintained for hours was now actively working against her success, but moving would require starting her environmental calculations from scratch, the 10th round chambered with ominous grinding sounds that indicated accelerated wear on precision surfaces never designed to operate under such extreme conditions. Elena felt the bolt catch and bind twice before achieving full closure, requiring force that threatened to damage the weapon's timing and headspace. She was operating a rifle that was essentially destroying itself with each shot racing against complete mechanical failure to finish her qualification before the weapon became unsafe to fire. Elena's scope reticle now wavered constantly from heat-induced tremor combined with thermal distortion rising from her own equipment, making precise aiming impossible through conventional techniques. She had learned to time her shots between tremor cycles, finding microscopic moments when her physiological rhythms aligned to provide temporary stability. The skill required reading her own body's responses while simultaneously interpreting external conditions that changed faster than conscious thought could process. The trigger broke with familiar precision, despite Elena's degraded motor control. But she could feel subtle changes in her technique that indicated her body was operating at the very limits of human capability. The shot felt different from earlier rounds, with recoil that seemed harsher due to thermal expansion in the rifle's stock and action components. She cycled the bolt immediately, knowing that hesitation would allow the weapon to cool in ways that could change its zero unpredictably. Elena watched the bullet trace through atmospheric distortion that made tracking impossible with her condensation fog optics, trusting that months of preparation and years of experience would guide the projectile toward its intended target. The vapor trail appeared and disappeared through heat layers that created optical illusions, making it seem as though the bullet was following an impossible curved path through the superheated air. Physics and mathematics would determine the outcome while she waited in the furnace of her shooting position. The impact confirmation came with the metallic ring of steel struck at impossible range, followed by Corporal Chun's amazed voice calling another center hit through atmospheric conditions that would have made the shot impossible for any marksman he had ever observed. Elena had now successfully engaged 10 consecutive targets under conditions that exceeded the design limits of her equipment and the normal boundaries of human performance. But one target remained at a distance that challenged the fundamental principles of rifle accuracy. Target 11 waited at 2,500 meters, positioned at a range so extreme that the bullet's flight time would exceed 5 seconds and require compensation for atmospheric effects that most ballistic computers couldn't calculate accurately. The steel plate existed beyond the visible horizon from Elena's prone position, requiring her to aim at empty sky while trusting mathematical calculations that pushed beyond established ballistic science. Success would require perfect execution of a shot that existed at the theoretical limits of what was possible with rifle and ammunition. Elena's rifle was now operating with mechanical characteristics that bore little resemblance to the precision instrument she had zeroed that morning, but her muscle memory adapted to the changing weapon dynamics with unconscious adjustments that compensated for thermal expansion and mechanical wear. Her shooting technique had evolved throughout the qualification to accommodate equipment degradation and environmental challenges that would have defeated less experienced marksmen. She was essentially shooting a different rifle than the one she had started with, but her adaptability allowed her to maintain accuracy despite the dramatic changes in weapon performance. The final round was chambered with movements that required conscious attention to overcome the rifle's mechanical resistance, her hands working against bolt surfaces that were now grinding against each other with sounds that indicated accelerated wear on precision components. Elena could feel heat radiating through the receiver into her face as she settled into position for the shot that would either complete the most difficult marksmanship qualification ever attempted or end in failure just meters short of absolute success. Elena's mind entered a state of focused clarity that transcended the physical discomfort and equipment limitations that surrounded her, channeling months of preparation into a single moment where perfect execution would either validate years of training or confirm that some achievements existed beyond human capability. The crosshairs found their position against empty sky while mathematics and instinct combined to guide her toward a target that existed more in calculation than visual reality. Elena's final calculation transcended mathematics and entered the realm of pure instinct as she prepared for a shot that existed beyond the established boundaries of rifle accuracy. 2,500 meters represented a distance where atmospheric effects dominated ballistic trajectory, where wind conditions could change multiple times during the projectile's 5-second flight, and where the target existed below the visible horizon from her shooting position. She was aiming at empty desert sky, trusting mathematical projections that pushed beyond the limits of established ballistic science. The rifle's chamber had reached temperatures that would have destroyed lesser weapons, the steel components glowing with heat that radiated through her face mask as she settled into position. Elena could smell the synthetic materials in her equipment beginning to degrade from thermal exposure, releasing chemical odors that mixed with the metallic scent of overheated steel. Her ammunition was operating so far beyond safe specifications that each trigger pull represented a calculated gamble with physics and metallurgy. Elena's body had achieved a state of physiological efficiency that bordered on the impossible. Her metabolic processes adapted to function despite dehydration levels that should have resulted in heat stroke hours earlier. Her vision remained sharp despite the physical stress, her hands steady despite tremors that would have defeated any marksman she had ever known. Years of combat experience and thousands of hours of training had prepared her for this moment when human capability met the absolute limits of what was achievable. The crosshair settled into position against the empty sky above where mathematical calculations indicated the invisible target waited. Elena's holdover was so extreme that casual observers would assume she was aiming at clouds rather than attempting precision fire at a steel plate hidden beyond the desert horizon. Her scope's condensation had reached levels that would have made the shot impossible under normal circumstances, but Elena's muscle memory guided her to the correct site. Picture through pure instinct. The trigger broke with crystalline precision. Despite the rifle's thermal distortion and Elena's degraded motor control, releasing the final round in a qualification sequence that had pushed human marksmanship beyond previously established limits. The rifle's recoil felt harsh against her shoulder as overheated components transferred energy in ways that differed dramatically from the weapon's normal characteristics. Elena maintained her shooting position, following through with sight picture and trigger pressure while watching the bullet trace disappear into atmospheric distortion. 5.5 seconds of flight time stretched into an eternity of suspended possibility as physics, mathematics, and preparation combined to determine whether Elena's achievement would redefine the boundaries of human marksmanship or fall just short of absolute perfection. The bullet traveled a parabolic arc that carried it nearly 30 feet above the line of sight before gravity claimed its victory, following a trajectory that most marksmen would consider impossible to calculate accurately. The impact sound came as a sharp crack that echoed across the valley with finality, confirming that steel had met lead at a distance that challenged the fundamental principles of rifle accuracy. Elena's scope was too fogged to reveal impact location, but Corporal Chun's spotting scope had tracked the bullet's path through atmospheric layers that bent light and redirected projectiles in ways that defied conventional ballistic wisdom. His confirmation call would determine whether months of preparation had culminated in perfection or near miss. Perfect center hit. Chun's voice carried across the desert with amazement that he couldn't suppress, confirming that Elena had achieved something beyond the realm of normal human capability. 11 consecutive hits at distances ranging from 800 to 2,500 meters, under environmental conditions that would have defeated any marksman in Marine Corps' history. She had not merely broken the existing record, she had redefined what was possible in precision. Marksmanship. Elena's rifle was now too hot to handle safely, the steel components radiating heat that would cause severe burns through direct contact. She used her cooling towel to safely clear the chamber and secure the weapon, her movements economical despite the physical stress that had pushed her body beyond normal operating limits. The precision instrument that had delivered perfect accuracy was now damaged beyond immediate repair, its sacrifice necessary for achieving the impossible. The medical team reached Elena's position within minutes, finding her conscious and coherent. Despite dehydration levels that should have resulted in heat stroke, her core body temperature had reached dangerous levels, but her physical conditioning and mental determination had carried her through conditions that would have hospitalized most people. The medical personnel immediately began cooling and rehydration procedures while marveling at her ability to maintain precision. shooting under such extreme physiological stress. Major General Morrison was the first senior officer to reach Elena's position. Her own uniform soaked with perspiration from the desert heat as she climbed the ridge to personally congratulate the Marine, who had just shattered every assumption about female capabilities in precision marksmanship. Morrison understood the historical significance of Elena's achievement better than anyone, recognizing that this performance would force the Marine Corps to reevaluate gender restrictions that had been based on assumptions rather than evidence. Elena's qualification score of 100% under impossible conditions didn't just break the existing record. It established a new standard that might never be equaled by any marksman regardless of gender. The combination of technical skill, physical endurance, and mental fortitude she had demonstrated transcended the capabilities that most military planners believed possible. Her achievement would be studied and analyzed for decades as an example of human potential, unleashed under extreme conditions. The immediate aftermath brought a flood of congratulations and recognition that Elena accepted with characteristic humility. Deflecting praise to her instructors and training partners who had prepared her for this moment, she understood that her individual achievement represented something larger than personal success. It was validation for every woman who had been told she lacked the capability to excel in traditionally male-dominated fields requiring physical and mental toughness. News of Elena's record-breaking performance spread throughout the military community within hours, generating discussions about gender restrictions that had been based on outdated assumptions about female capabilities under combat stress. Her achievement provided irrefutable evidence that properly trained and motivated female Marines could not only compete with their male counterparts, but could exceed performance standards that had been considered the absolute pinnacle of human capability. Elena's story resonated far beyond military circles, inspiring women in law enforcement, competitive shooting, and other precision-demanding fields to pursue opportunities that had previously been considered impossible to achieve. Her demonstration that gender had no bearing on the combination of technical skill, mental discipline, and physical endurance required for extreme marksmanship opened doors that had been closed by prejudice rather than evidence. The rifle that had delivered Elena's perfect performance was retired to the Marine Corps Museum as a testament to what became possible when human determination met the limits of equipment capability. The weapon bore the scars of thermal stress and environmental abuse that had been necessary to achieve perfection under impossible conditions, serving as a permanent reminder that extraordinary achievements often require pushing beyond the boundaries of what seems safe or reasonable. Elena's qualification opened sniper schools to female Marines for the first time in military history, with her performance serving as the benchmark that forced institutional change throughout the Corps. The Marines who followed her path would benefit from her pioneer efforts, facing fewer barriers and more opportunities because one woman had been willing to prove that gender meant nothing when measured against skill, determination, and the courage to attempt the impossible. Years later, Elena would reflect on that scorching day in the Nevada desert, not as the moment she broke records, but as the day she proved that human potential knows no gender boundaries when combined with proper training, unwavering determination, and the courage to push beyond what others consider possible. Her legacy lived not in the targets she hit, but in the barriers she shattered and the doors she opened for those who followed. If Elena's story of breaking barriers and redefining impossible reminded you that limitation exists primarily in our assumptions rather than our capabilities, share your thoughts about overcoming the boundaries others place on your potential. Follow for more stories of individuals who refuse to accept that their gender, background, or circumstances determined what they could achieve. The weeks following Elena's record-breaking performance brought a cascade of changes that rippled through every level of the Marine Corps' hierarchy as senior leadership grappled with the implications of having their fundamental assumptions about gender and combat capability shattered by a single day's shooting. Elena found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought, becoming the unwilling symbol of a debate that had raged for decades about women's roles in direct combat positions. Every interview request, speaking engagement, and photo opportunity carried political weight that extended far beyond her personal achievement. Elena's medical recovery from the extreme heat exposure took longer than anticipated, with doctors marveling at her ability to maintain cognitive function and motor control under conditions that should have resulted in heat stroke hours before her qualification ended. The combination of severe dehydration, thermal stress, and physical exhaustion had pushed her body beyond normal operational limits, requiring weeks of careful monitoring to ensure no permanent damage had occurred. Her physician noted that her recovery time was actually shorter than expected, suggesting that her mental conditioning had somehow protected her from the worst effects of heat injury. The rifle that had delivered Elena's perfect performance underwent detailed examination by Marine Corps armorers, who documented the extreme thermal stress and mechanical wear that had resulted from firing under impossible conditions. The weapon's barrel showed signs of thermal expansion that should have destroyed accuracy completely, while the bolt and receiver exhibited wear patterns that typically required thousands of rounds to develop. The fact that Elena had maintained precision despite equipment degradation that would have defeated any other marksman became part of the legend surrounding her achievement. Elena's ammunition manufacturer requested samples of the cartridges she had fired for analysis, seeking to understand how their products had performed under conditions that exceeded all safety specifications by enormous margins. The powder burn rates documented during her qualification provided valuable data about ammunition performance under extreme temperatures, leading to improvements in military cartridge design that would benefit future generations of precision shooters. Her qualification had inadvertently become a real-world test of equipment, limits that couldn't be replicated under controlled laboratory conditions. Congressional hearings were scheduled within months of Elena's achievement as lawmakers sought to understand why gender restrictions had persisted in military specialties, where physical capability appeared to be the primary determining factor. Elena's testimony before the House Armed Services Committee became a watershed moment in military policy, as she calmly explained the technical aspects of precision marksmanship while deflecting questions designed to minimize her accomplishment. Her professional demeanor and obvious competence made it impossible for skeptics to dismiss her achievement as an anomaly or statistical outlier. Elena's training partners and instructors found themselves elevated to celebrity status within the military community as reporters and researchers sought to understand how such exceptional performance had been developed and sustained. Corporal Chun was promoted ahead of schedule and assigned to train the first female Marines who entered sniper school following Elena's qualification. The techniques and methods that had produced Elena's success became standard curriculum, with her training logs and performance data studied by marksmanship instructors throughout the military. The civilian competitive shooting community embraced Elena as a trailblazer whose achievement validated their own efforts to promote gender equality in precision rifle sports. Major equipment manufacturers offered sponsorship deals that would have provided financial security for life, but Elena declined most commercial opportunities to maintain her focus on military service. Her decision to prioritize duty over profit enhanced her reputation within the Marine Corps while demonstrating that her motivations extended beyond personal gain or recognition. Elena's family struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what she had accomplished, with her father finally acknowledging that his daughter had achieved something beyond his own military experience. The Vietnam veteran, who had once opposed Elena's decision to pursue combat roles, became her most vocal supporter, speaking at veterans' organizations about the courage required to challenge institutional barriers. Her mother framed newspaper clippings and magazine articles about Elena's achievement, creating a shrine to her daughter's success that occupied an entire wall of their home. Military academies began incorporating Elena's qualification into their curriculum as a case study in human performance under extreme conditions, analyzing not just her shooting technique but her mental preparation and stress management under impossible circumstances. West Point's psychology department used video footage of her qualification to study decision-making under pressure, while the Naval Academy's physics instructors used her ballistic calculations to demonstrate advanced trajectory analysis. Her achievement became a teaching tool that transcended military applications. Elena's personal relationships were transformed by her sudden fame, as friends and colleagues struggled to reconcile the person they knew with the public figure she had become. Dating became complicated by her celebrity status and the intimidation factor that many potential partners felt when confronted with someone who had achieved legendary status within her field. Elena learned to navigate social situations where her reputation preceded her, often preferring to avoid discussing her achievement in casual conversation. The political implications of Elena's success extended beyond military policy to broader questions about gender equality in physically demanding professions. Police departments began re-evaluating their sniper selection criteria, while federal agencies reconsidered restrictions that had limited female participation in tactical roles. Elena's demonstration that gender had no bearing on the mental discipline and technical skill required for precision shooting forced institutional changes throughout law enforcement and military special operations communities. Elena's continued military service following her record-breaking qualification demonstrated her commitment to duty rather than personal glory, as she requested assignment to active duty units rather than training or administrative positions that would have capitalized on her fame. Her commanders initially resisted deploying someone who had become a valuable public relations asset, but Elena's insistence on serving in operational roles eventually prevailed. She wanted to prove that her achievement was not just a one-time performance but representative of sustained capability under combat conditions. The psychological pressure of living up to her own achievement created challenges that Elena hadn't anticipated, as every subsequent shooting performance was measured against the impossible standard she had established. Range sessions that would have been considered excellent by any objective measure felt disappointing when compared to her perfect qualification score. Elena worked with military psychologists to develop coping strategies for managing the expectations that came with being considered the finest marksman in Marine Corps history. Elena's mentorship of younger female Marines became an unofficial additional duty as the Corps sought to capitalize on her example to recruit and retain women in combat specialties. She found herself serving as a role model for Marines who had grown up hearing that certain military occupations were unsuitable for women, helping them navigate the cultural and institutional barriers that persisted despite official policy changes. Her influence extended beyond marksmanship to general leadership and professional development. The scientific community embraced Elena's achievement as a case study in human performance optimization, with researchers from multiple disciplines seeking to understand how she had maintained precision under conditions that should have overwhelmed normal human capability. Sports psychologists studied her mental preparation techniques, while physiologists analyzed her body's adaptation to extreme environmental stress. Her qualification became a benchmark for understanding the upper limits of human performance under adverse conditions. Elena's story inspired documentary filmmakers and authors who recognized the broader implications of her achievement for society's understanding of gender and capability. Multiple book deals and film options were offered, but Elena maintained control over her story while ensuring that any portrayal emphasized the institutional changes her success had enabled rather than focusing solely on individual accomplishment. She understood that her legacy would be measured not by personal recognition, but by the opportunities she had created for others. International military Forces began inviting Elena to participate in training exchanges and competitive events, recognizing that her expertise represented a strategic advantage that transcended national boundaries. Her participation in multinational training exercises provided opportunities to demonstrate American military excellence while advancing broader goals of international cooperation. Elena's reputation as the world's finest precision marksman became a source of national pride that extended beyond military circles. The long-term impact of Elena's achievement continued to unfold years after her qualification, as the female Marines who followed her path began establishing their own records and reputations within the sniper community. Her example had created a pipeline of highly qualified women who no longer faced the assumption that gender determined capability in precision shooting. The institutional changes she had forced became permanent fixtures of military policy rather than temporary accommodations. Elena's return to active duty following her record-breaking qualification brought challenges that no amount of training had prepared her for, as military bureaucracy struggled to determine how best to utilize someone whose capabilities had redefined the limits of human marksmanship. Traditional sniper deployment patterns assumed teams of 2 operators working together, but Elena's demonstrated ability to engage targets at ranges exceeding normal spotter scope effectiveness meant that standard tactical doctrine needed revision. Her first deployment to Afghanistan came with modified rules of engagement that reflected her unique capabilities and the strategic value of her precision shooting skills. The Taliban fighters who learned of Elena's presence in their operational area initially dismissed reports of a female sniper as American propaganda designed to demoralize their forces. Their skepticism evaporated during her first engagement, when she eliminated 3 insurgent leaders with consecutive shots, fired from positions that local forces had considered impossible to utilize effectively. Word spread through enemy networks that an American shooter was operating with capabilities that exceeded anything they had previously encountered, forcing tactical changes that disrupted their operational planning throughout the region. Elena's combat deployments validated every aspect of her training and qualification performance, as she consistently delivered precision fire at ranges and under conditions that other snipers found impossible to manage. Her confirmed kill count reached triple digits within 18 months of deployment, with many engagements occurring at distances exceeding 2,000 meters under combat stress that would have overwhelmed less experienced marksmen. Military historians noted that her combat effectiveness equaled or exceeded legendary snipers from previous conflicts, establishing her as one of the most successful precision shooters in American military history. Coalition forces began requesting Elena's support for operations that had previously been considered too dangerous or technically challenging for sniper engagement, recognizing that her capabilities could provide solutions to tactical problems that conventional approaches couldn't address. Her ability to neutralize threats at extreme range while remaining concealed allowed special operations teams to operate with reduced risk in areas where enemy observation posts had previously made missions impossible. Elena's precision fire became a force multiplier that enhanced the effectiveness of entire units rather than just providing individual target elimination. Elena's equipment requirements evolved to match her exceptional capabilities, as standard military rifles and optics proved inadequate for the distances and conditions under which she operated most effectively. Custom-built weapon systems were developed specifically for her use, incorporating technological advances that pushed the boundaries of what was considered practical for field deployment. Her input on equipment design influenced the development of next-generation sniper systems that would eventually be adopted throughout the military, with her combat experience providing real-world validation of theoretical improvements. The psychological warfare value of Elena's presence became apparent as enemy forces modified their behavior patterns to avoid areas where she might be operating, effectively denying terrain to hostile forces without conventional military occupation. Intelligence reports indicated that Taliban and other insurgent groups were relocating command posts and altering movement patterns based on rumors of her deployment, demonstrating that a single highly skilled operator could influence enemy strategy across broad geographical areas. Elena's reputation had become a weapon in itself. Elena's mentorship responsibilities expanded during her combat deployments as junior snipers sought to learn from someone whose capabilities had been proven under the most demanding conditions possible. Her teaching methods emphasized fundamentals and mental discipline rather than attempting to replicate the extraordinary performance that had made her famous, recognizing that sustainable excellence required mastery of basics rather than reliance on exceptional circumstances. Many of her students achieved their own combat success by applying principles that Elena had refined through years of precision shooting under stress. Military medical research teams studied Elena's physiological responses to combat stress, seeking to understand how she maintained precision under conditions that typically degraded performance in other operators. Her ability to regulate heart rate, breathing, and fine motor control during firefights provided insights into stress management that could benefit all military personnel regardless of specialty. The data collected during her deployments contributed to training programs designed to improve performance under combat stress throughout the armed forces. Elena's tactical innovations influenced sniper doctrine development as her successful techniques were analyzed and incorporated into training curricula for future generations of precision shooters. Her methods for reading environmental conditions at extreme range, compensating for equipment limitations under adverse circumstances, and maintaining accuracy despite physiological stress became standard subjects in advanced marksmanship schools. Military institutions worldwide requested access to Elena's training materials and operational after-action reports. The intelligence value of Elena's position reports and target assessments proved nearly as valuable as her direct fire capabilities, as her training and experience allowed her to provide detailed tactical intelligence from observation posts that other operators couldn't effectively utilize. Her ability to maintain concealed positions for extended periods while gathering information about enemy activities provided commanders with situational awareness that enhanced planning for major operations. Elena's role evolved beyond pure marksmanship to include reconnaissance and surveillance, responsibilities that maximized her unique skill set. Elena's rotation back to the United States after multiple combat deployments brought adjustment challenges, common to all returning veterans, but amplified by her unique status within the military community. Civilian life held little appeal for someone whose professional identity had been forged through extreme performance under conditions that few people could comprehend, let alone replicate. Elena struggled with the transition from combat operations, where her skills were constantly challenged, to peacetime duties that felt mundane by comparison. The Marine Corps recognized Elena's value as an instructor and assigned her to develop advanced training programs for the next generation of female snipers who would follow her path into combat specialties. Her curriculum emphasized mental preparation and stress management alongside technical marksmanship skills, recognizing that combat effectiveness required psychological resilience as much as shooting ability. Elena's teaching methods produced graduates whose performance exceeded previous standards for military marksmen, regardless of gender. Elena's influence on popular culture grew despite her efforts to maintain focus on military service rather than celebrity status, as her story inspired countless articles, documentaries, and fictional portrayals of female combat veterans. Hollywood producers offered substantial sums for movie rights to her story, but Elena maintained creative control to ensure any portrayal emphasized the institutional changes her success had enabled rather than sensationalizing individual combat actions. She understood that her public image carried responsibility for representing all women in military service, academic institutions, began offering Elena positions that would have provided comfortable civilian careers away from the physical demands and psychological stress of military service. But she consistently chose to remain in the Marines, where her experience could benefit operational units and training programs. Her decision to prioritize service over personal advancement enhanced her reputation within the military, while demonstrating that her motivations transcended individual career considerations. Elena's commitment to duty became part of her legend. Elena's awards and decorations accumulated to levels rarely achieved by any Marine regardless of specialty, but she wore them with understated pride that reflected her understanding that individual recognition represented the collective efforts of teams that had supported her success. Her medal ceremonies became opportunities to highlight the contributions of spotters, instructors, armorers, and medical personnel whose expertise had enabled her achievements. Elena consistently deflected credit while ensuring that supporting personnel received appropriate recognition for their roles in her success. The strategic implications of Elena's capabilities influenced military planning at the highest levels, as commanders recognized that properly employed precision shooters could achieve tactical objectives that would otherwise require larger forces with greater risk of casualties. Elena's proven ability to neutralize high-value targets under adverse conditions provided options for dealing with threats that conventional approaches couldn't address effectively. Her existence in the force structure gave military planners confidence to attempt missions that would have been considered too risky without her unique capabilities. Elena's legacy continued to evolve as the female Marines she had inspired achieved their own combat successes and advanced to leadership positions throughout the corps. The institutional changes her achievement had forced became permanent features of military culture rather than temporary accommodations, ensuring that future generations of women would face fewer barriers to pursuing combat specialties. Elena's influence extended far beyond her individual performance to encompass fundamental changes in how the military evaluated capability and potential. 20 years after Elena's record-breaking qualification, she stood before a packed auditorium at Marine Corps Base Quantico, addressing the largest gathering of female snipers in military history. The women seated before her represented every branch of the armed forces, with some having traveled from allied nations specifically to hear from the Marine who had shattered gender barriers through pure skill and determination. Elena's hair showed threads of silver now, and her uniform bore the insignia of a full colonel, but her eyes still held the same steely focus that had guided bullets across impossible distances on that scorching Nevada morning. The youngest Marine in the audience was barely 18, having enlisted specifically because Elena's example had shown her that marksmanship excellence was attainable regardless of gender. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos sat in the front row, her own chest decorated with ribbons from 3 combat deployments where she had followed Elena's path into sniper operations. Santos had recently broken Elena's training record for consecutive hits at extended range, proving that the standard Elena had established was not just achievable but surpassable by those who followed her example with equal dedication. Elena's speech that day focused not on her own achievements, but on the mathematical progression of excellence that each successive generation of female snipers had achieved. She displayed charts showing accuracy improvements, range extensions, and mission success rates that demonstrated how breaking the initial barrier had accelerated progress beyond what anyone had predicted. The women in her audience were operating with capabilities that exceeded those of the male snipers who had once argued that female Marines lacked the necessary attributes for precision shooting under combat conditions. Behind Elena on the stage sat Major General Patricia Morrison, now retired but serving as president of the Veterans of Foreign Wars Women's Auxiliary. Morrison had been present for Elena's original qualification and had since witnessed the transformation of military culture that single day had initiated. The general smiled as she listened to Elena describe the current generation of female snipers, who were setting new standards for combat effectiveness while serving in roles that had been close to women. Just 2 decades earlier, the technological advances in precision shooting equipment had paralleled the advancement of female participation in sniper roles, with manufacturers now designing systems specifically to accommodate the physiological differences that could actually provide advantages in certain shooting scenarios. Elena's input had influenced the development of rifles and optics that maximized accuracy potential for operators of all body types, resulting in equipment improvements that benefited male and female shooters equally. Her legacy lived not just in broken barriers, but in technological progress that enhanced human capability. Elena's granddaughter sat proudly in the family section, wearing a junior ROTC uniform that bore marksman badges earned through training at civilian shooting competitions. The 12-year-old girl had grown up hearing stories of her grandmother's achievements, but understood them as normal rather than extraordinary, representing a generational shift where female excellence in traditionally male-dominated fields was accepted as natural rather than remarkable. Elena's greatest pride came from knowing that her granddaughter would never face the assumption that gender determined capability. The documentary crew filming Elena's speech was completing a project that would air on military history channels worldwide, part of a series examining how individual achievements had catalyzed institutional change throughout modern military history. Elena's story would be presented alongside accounts of other barrier-breaking veterans whose courage to challenge assumptions had opened opportunities for countless others. The filmmakers had spent months interviewing the women whose careers had been enabled by Elena's pioneering efforts, creating a comprehensive record of progress achieved through individual determination. Elena's medical files had become subjects of ongoing research by military physiologists seeking to understand how exceptional performance could be sustained under extreme stress conditions. Her ability to maintain precision while managing heat exhaustion, equipment failures, and psychological pressure had provided insights that influenced training programs throughout the military. The techniques developed from studying Elena's stress responses were now standard curriculum in schools, training operators for high-stress environments. Private defense contractors had offered Elena consulting positions that would have provided substantial financial compensation for her expertise in precision shooting and training program development, but she had consistently chosen to share her knowledge through military channels, where it could benefit the maximum number of service members. Her decision to prioritize service over profit had enhanced her reputation, while ensuring that innovations developed through her experience remained available to all military personnel rather than being limited to commercial clients. Elena's shooting logs from her record-breaking qualification had been preserved in the Marine Corps Museum alongside her rifle and equipment, serving as primary source documents for military historians studying the evolution of precision marksmanship. Students and researchers regularly requested access to her notes and calculations, finding insights into decision-making under pressure that transcended military applications. Elena's methodical documentation of her thought processes had become a case study in maintaining performance under impossible conditions. The international recognition of Elena's achievements had elevated American military prestige while demonstrating the strategic advantages that emerged from maximizing human potential regardless of traditional limitations. Foreign military delegations regularly visited Marine Corps training facilities to observe techniques that had been developed through Elena's experience, with many nations implementing similar programs to develop their own female precision shooters. Elena's influence had become a force multiplier for American military effectiveness worldwide. Elena's retirement ceremony the following year drew attendees from across the military spectrum, with her replacement as senior instructor being a female Marine who had entered sniper training specifically because Elena's example had made it possible. The transition represented institutional maturity where exceptional performance was recognized and rewarded based on capability rather than gender, fulfilling Elena's original goal of creating opportunities for others to excel without facing arbitrary barriers based on irrelevant characteristics. The foundation Elena established during her retirement focused on providing marksmanship training opportunities for young women in civilian shooting sports, recognizing that military excellence often emerged from foundations built through early exposure to precision shooting disciplines. Her foundation scholarships had enabled dozens of young women to pursue competitive shooting careers that might otherwise have been financially impossible, creating a pipeline of talent that would eventually benefit military recruiting and training programs. Elena's final interview before retiring from public speaking was conducted by the same military journalist who had first written about her record-breaking qualification 2 decades earlier. The reporter noted that Elena's most significant achievement was not the perfect shooting performance that had made her famous, but the institutional changes that performance had forced throughout the military establishment. Elena's legacy would be measured not in targets hit but in barriers removed and opportunities created for future generations. Elena's story represents something larger than individual achievement or military excellence. It demonstrates the power of refusing to accept limitations imposed by others' assumptions about what we can accomplish. Elena didn't just break shooting records. She shattered the invisible barriers that had prevented countless other women from pursuing their full potential in fields where they had been told they didn't belong. Every time someone achieves something they were told was impossible for people like them, they create possibilities for everyone who follows. Elena's perfect performance under impossible conditions proved that excellence has no gender, no background, no predetermined limitations beyond those we accept for ourselves. Her story challenges us to examine our own assumptions about what we can achieve and what barriers we've allowed others to place on our potential. Whether you're pursuing goals in athletics, academics, career advancement, or personal development, Elena's example reminds us that extraordinary achievement often requires going beyond what feels safe or reasonable. What barriers have others told you are insurmountable? What achievements have you dismissed as impossible for someone with your background or circumstances? Elena's legacy lives in every person who refuses to accept that their gender, age, background, or any other characteristic determines what they can accomplish. If Elena's story of transforming impossible into inevitable inspired you to reconsider the limitations you've accepted for yourself, share your thoughts in the comments about the barriers you're ready to break. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of individuals who refuse to let others define what they could achieve, and join our community of people committed to pushing beyond the boundaries that exist only in our assumptions about what's possible.